I'm Ryan O'Doud, and you're listening to Ryan's Audiobooks on the Issues Magazine YouTube channel. Today we continue with section 11.5 from The Russian Cosmists, the Esoteric Futurism of Nikolai Fedderov and His Followers by George Young. We're picking up in Chapter 5. A main feature of Russian Cosmism is its grounding in traditions of occult or esoteric knowledge. Some of these traditions are specific to Russia. Others are common to Western civilization. And still others seem to be shared by many cultures. Of the Cosmists, only a few, Solovyov, Berdyaev, Florensky, and Tsiolkovsky, openly admitted at least a temporary immersion in esoteric literature or practices. But we shall see Russians from all social classes and intellectual tendencies have for centuries found occult teachings profoundly attractive, and by transforming matter, usually considered esoteric, into a new theology, philosophy, and science, the Cosmists add to, rather than depart from, a long Russian tradition. Early searches for deep wisdom. In The Origins of Russia, George Vernadsky cites one of the early accounts of practice of magic in Slavic lands, the meadows of gold and the mines of gems, by the 10th century Arab historian and geographer Abu al-Hasan Ali ibn al-Hussein ibn Ali al-Mosidi. The Slavs believed that the course of the sun affected the fortunes of mankind. Masudi relates that among the Slavic temples there was one situated on a high mountain, so built that it was easy, through special openings, to observe the points of sunrise. Precious stones were inserted in various parts of the building and magic signs carved in stone. By coordinating the data on the course of the sun and magic meaning of the precious stones and of the signs, Slavic high priests prophesied future events. As we shall see later, in our discussion of Alexander Shishevsky, belief in a direct correlation between the course of the sun and the course of human events was not confined to pre-scientific seekers of knowledge. As W.F. Ryan demonstrates in his indispensable account of the early history of magic in Russia, The Bathhouse at Midnight, the practice of folk magic and sorcery was common and accepted at all levels of society, even after the coming of Christianity, but learned Hermetic and Neoplatonic esotericism made only fragmentary appearances. At the end of the 14th and beginning of the 15th century, the first Russian medical, scientific, and proto-scientific texts began to appear, modeled on, if not translated from, Greek originals. These include presentations of the four humors, explanation of the microcosm and macrocosm, astrological advice on the best and worst days for certain activities such as planting, pruning, slaughtering livestock, letting blood, and cutting hair. In one of the earliest such books, Glubinaya Kniga, the Book of Deep Wisdom, Prince Vladimir and King David engage in dialogues on the power of light, the divinity of the sun, and other theurgical themes drawing on both pagan and Christian views of the world. In the 15th century, Secretum Secretorum, originally an Arabic work that had been translated into Hebrew, and which purported to be secret instructions given to Alexander the Great by Aristotle, began to appear in Old Russian translations. Ryan explains, the Secretum is notable in that it is not only a work which would appeal to Russians because of its association with the popular Alexander stories, but also because of its advocacy of astrology and the fact that it contained an onomantic table for predicting the outcomes of battles, the first alchemical text in Old Russian, a description of the magical properties of precious stones and magical talismans, and two separate works of physiognomy. Two well-known works of medieval literature, the Stoglav, 100 chapters, and the Mostroi, domestic order, offer further evidence of magical practices in pre-Petrine Russia. In Stoglov, produced by a council called by Ivan the Terrible to identify and prescribe superstitions and irreligious practices of the time, the list of activities to be forbidden includes various forms of divination, numerology, astrology, and spellcasting. Of particular relevance to our study of Cosmism is a passage in chapter 41. On Thursday of Passion Week, people burn straw and call up the dead, and on this day ignorant priests put salt under the altar, which they then keep until the 7th Thursday after Easter, when it becomes a cure for sick men or beasts. The council replies that this is a Hellene seduction and heresy, and any priest involved in this is to be excluded from the priesthood. Here we have, as heretical superstition, 2 thaumaturgical impulses that will reappear as projective science in cosmist writings: the hope of calling the dead back to life, and the hope that faith in time will transform a natural element of ordinary daily use, like salt, into a cure for diseases in animals and people. The Demonstroi, the earliest versions of which probably predate Stoglov, list many of the same practices to be avoided in domestic life, warning especially that women should not be allowed to associate with witches or wizards or to practice magic themselves. As for most other offenses by women, the Demonstroi recommends that the husband, not the church or state, should beat or otherwise punish the wife who ventures into the supernatural. Fortunately for the Cosmists and others who might later conduct ventures into the supernatural, by the 19th century the Demonstroi had lost at least some of its influence. Ryan tells us that from the time of Ivan III, 1540 to 1605, all the rulers of Muscovy for the next 2 centuries up to Peter the Great seem to have had, or were accustomed to having, some knowledge of magic, alchemy, or astrology, or all 3. This knowledge came primarily from Westerners invited to serve in the Muscovite court as physicians, scientists, or general advisors, such as Jacob Boehm's follower, the mystical poet and utopian thinker Quirinus Kuhlmann, who came to Moscow's German quarter in 1689, looking to attract adherents to his utopian ideals, but who was burned at the stake with one of his local hosts for heresy in October of that year. One of those who rejected an invitation to serve in Moscow was the famous magus of Elizabeth I of England. Dr. John Dee, although his son Arthur Dee would serve as personal physician to Tsar Michael Romanov between 1621 and 1635. Westerners such as Count Cagliostro, Count Saint Germain, and Douglas Home would serve the esoteric needs of 18th and 19th century Russian high society, and by the early 20th century, homegrown talents such as Grigory Rasputin would make importation less necessary. Popular magic. In Russia, as elsewhere in pre-modern times, interest in and practice of magic was generally of 2 kinds. The popular use of spells, charms, casts, and the like by the uneducated, and the learned study of Greek, Hebrew, and Western European texts by rulers, members of the court, and learned clergy, though sometimes the line between high and low magic was blurred, as with the educated, literate Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, 1629 to 1696, who, despite his cultivation, had the hut of a recently deceased witch, searched for roots, plants, scraps of writing, and anything else that could be put to magical use, and who ordered the gathering of magical herbs at midsummer. Several other examples of the practice of popular magic in pre-Petrine Russia point forward in time towards the Cosmists. One is the idea that a clear footprint in the mud or snow can be used in hostile magic against the person who left it, demonstrating the belief that an absent person can still be considered present and affected through traces left behind of him or herself. Fedorov would propose that all matter contains the dust of our ancestors, and that traces of ancestral dust could be extracted and used not to do hostile magic, but scientifically to restore life to the departed. The purpose is different, but the principle is similar, employing the trace to arrive at the whole person. Another transformation of medieval popular magic is in the protective devices one must use when attempting to perform magic. Even the act of performing beneficial magic can open the door to powerful evil forces. So to protect oneself, one should hold or wear a cross, or if working without a cross, draw a magic circle into which nothing evil can intrude. In Cosmism, the danger is the unintended damage that can occur from powerful technology applied even with the best intentions. As in medieval magic, the best protection for Cosmists is the cross, the conviction that all technological advance must be pursued, not for its own sake, but for the sake of and in the name of the Christian task of resurrection. In the folk tale cited by Ryan, a young woman feigning illness asks that doctors and Volki wizards be summoned to treat her, indicating that in the popular mind the practice of medicine and magic, the physician and the wizard may at times have been considered more or less the same thing. The Church Slavonic Gospel uses the same word, Volkny, for the figures we call the three kings or three wise men of the Nativity, and in 16th century document, Plato and Aristotle, the Greek philosophers who were believed to have foretold the coming of Christ, are also referred to as Volkvi. In the West, and in the learned circles of Muscovy, the line between Volkvi on one side and scientists and philosophers on the other was being drawn, and at least among the learned would remain more or less clearly drawn until the Cosmists would, effectively if unintentionally, blur it once again, so that, as in old Russian popular culture, the wizard and the scientist could once more be one and the same. Higher magic in the time of Peter the Great. The study of higher magic from ancient and foreign esoteric texts was, as noted above, fragmentary and sporadic until the time of Peter the Great. Learned esotericism, then, as opposed to popular magic and superstition, began to have its most significant impact in Russia with the coming of 18th century of Freemasonry, with its emphasis on the craft of constructing a better man and better world. The claim sometimes made that Peter himself was initiated, possibly by Sir Christopher Wren, on his visit to London in 1697-1698, has not been proved, but recent research by Robert Collis has at least demonstrated Peter's lively interest in alchemy, the attempt not only to produce gold from base metals, but to forge higher men from common mortals. Collis cites an account of Peter's meeting on March 28th, 1698, with the Oxford chemist and physician Moses Stringer. The Tsar sent some days since for Mr. Stringer, an Oxford chemist, to show him some of the choicest secrets and experiments known to England. Accordingly, Mr. Stringer drew up a class or number of experiments, some in separating and refining of metals and minerals, some geometrical, some medicinal, others philosophical, to the number of 24 experiments. When they were drawn up, the Tsar elected one to be done first. And it seems it was one of the most difficult operations, which shows that the Tsar is skilled in natural philosophy. However, he desired to see the experiment done, which was performed to his satisfaction. It was to melt 4 metals with a destroying mineral together, the gold, silver, copper, and iron with antimony, into one lump, then to dissolve them all, and then to separate each metal distinct again, without destroying any one of them. It chanced after he had made some lead out of its ore, and silver out of that lead, and called the gold from the rest of the metals mixed, being transported into a merry vein, told the Tsar, if his majesty would wear that gold in a ring for his sake, he would make him an artificial gem of what color he pleased to name, to set in it, out of an old broomstaff and a piece of flint that lay by them. His majesty, being pleased with the fancy, ordered it to be done, he staying by part of the time, and his secretary the rest till it was done, and then it proved so hard that it cut glass. Although there is no evidence that Peter himself practiced alchemy, he maintained a lifelong interest in the subject, holding major alchemical texts in his private library, including Basil Valentine's The 12 Keys and the Triumphal Chariot of Antimony, and including among his closest Masonic associates and advisors 3 men deeply involved in alchemical and other esoteric researches. The first of the 3, Jacob Bruce, called by Pushkin the Russian Faust, was the Russian-born son of William Bruce, descendant of Robert I the Bruce, King of Scotland, and one of a number of Scots, many of them Freemasons, who came to Russia just before, during, and after the failure of the Jacobite movement. Over a long, distinguished military, diplomatic, and administrative career, Jacob Bruce was recognized as one of the most brilliant representatives of Petrine Russia. His outstanding achievements won him many public honors. But during and long after his brilliant career, legends of his sorcery continued to circulate, including stories of his ability to create a mute house made from flowers, his invention of a concoction which, when poured from a vial, brought a dead dog back to life, and a similar concoction which restored youth to an old man. But as Robert Collis notes, the most remarkable evidence of Bruce's deep interest in alchemy can undoubtedly be found in his private library collection. Astonishingly, it is certainly on par with the confiscated library of Nikolai Novikov in its range of chemical, hermetic, and occult content. Indeed, the claim that Rosicrucianism and Rosicrucian texts were only brought to Russia in the 1770s and 1780s by I.G. Schwartz, an associate of Novikov's, is severely undermined by the nature of Bruce's library, which contains many significant Rosicrucian-inspired volumes. Collis goes on to list many of the more than 140 occult texts in that library. Bruce then could well have served Peter the Great as a magus on the order of Elizabeth I's Dr. John Dee. The second close associate of the Tsar was an ecclesiast of encyclopedic erudition, Feofan Propanovich, 1681 to 1736. An eloquent ideologist for Petrine absolutism, and chief panegyrist of the emperor's glorious military and diplomatic achievements, Propakovich, as Collis notes, became the spearhead for a program of radical ecclesiastic reform. In clear opposition to the old Muscovite clergy, Prokopovich, who before coming to St. Petersburg had taught a wide variety of subjects at the Kiev Academy, advocated scientific as well as spiritual education. His profound interest in all branches of knowledge included a defense of alchemical research, and what the Soviet historian V.M. Nichik terms Prokopovich's Neoplatonic ideas about the origin of the world by the path of divine emanation. Although Prokopovich's library was not as rich as Bruce's in alchemical literature, he did assemble a substantial collection of some 3,000 volumes, primarily theological, but containing a significant number of alchemical tomes written by at least 34 separate authors, including Daniel Sennert and many other works of a distinctly occult nature. The collection included standard esoteric works by Cornelius Agrippa, Paracelsus, Robert Flood, the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, and dozens of rare works on alchemical and other pre-scientific methods of transforming base elements, whether mineral or human, into incorruptible gold. As an archbishop, Prokopovich probably did not participate in Peter's drunken revelry with the notorious all-mad, all-jeering, all-drunken assembly, a secretive, bawdy fraternal group similar to 18th century London's Hellfire Club. But he was an important member of the more serious scientific and alchemical research group, the Neptune Society. Another member of the group, and the third of Peter's closest Masonic associates, was Robert Erskine, 1677 to 1718, a Scottish physician who established the first scientific botanical garden in Russia, and was later appointed director and chief librarian of Peter's Kunstkamera, a special collection of natural oddities still open to viewers in St. Petersburg. Unlike Bruce and Prokopovich, Erskine was not a prominent public figure during his lifetime, but he was highly esteemed by Peter, and during his relatively brief life of 41 years, he managed to amass one of the most extensive private alchemical collections in Europe for its day. In a collection of over 2,300 tomes, one can find at least 287 alchemical works by 157 separate authors, which accounts for over 32% of the total collection. This total compares favorably with the contemporaneous and nowadays renowned collections of Sir Isaac Newton and Sir Hans Sloane, who held 169 and 204 separate alchemical tomes respectively. In addition to many of the same works in the two previously described libraries, Erskine's collection featured an especially strong collection of Rosicrucian literature, the first clear instance of the presence of this movement in Russia. As Collis relates, Erskine was at the center of a Jacobite network that significantly influenced Peter's designs for a new Russia and helped to seal, depicting a Pygmalion-like sculptor creating an idealized human figure from rough stone, featured Masonic imagery and emblems. His creation of fraternal and mock-fraternal hierarchical organizations, from the bureaucratic table of ranks to the secretive scientific Neptune Society, and the bawdy all-mad, all-jesting, all-drunken assembly, may owe as much to Masonic as to ecclesiastical modes of hierarchy. As Collis demonstrates, even if Peter himself was not officially a Mason, his goals and principles for reshaping Russia into a forward-looking, westernized empire bear a strong resemblance to those of early 18th century Freemasonry. The goal common to Peter and to 18th century Russian Freemasonry of hewing the rough stone, reshaping both the individual Russian and Russian culture as a whole, also lays a solid foundation for later, more radical hewings and reshapings to be proposed by Fedorov and his Cosmists. Esotericism after Peter the Great. If, as Collis submits, Freemasonry played a significant and previously underestimated role in the Petrine reforms of the first quarter of the 18th century, the importance of Masonic ideas and activities later in the century, particularly under Catherine the Great, 1729 to 1796, ruled from 1762, has long been recognized. The major figure in the movement was Nikolai Novikov, 1744 to 1818, a writer, editor, and publisher who was instrumental in propagating not only Rosicrucianism and Martinism, but also Shakespeare and the other enlightening literature then new to Russia. Shortly after the French Revolution, however, he was arrested by Catherine and saw his press smashed and his inventory destroyed. Novikov was the force behind which Raffaele Faglionato has called Russia's Rosicrucian utopia, in which the ideals of Rosicrucian Christianity, with its secret inner teachings supposedly reaching back before Christ to ancient Egyptian and Chaldean sources, were becoming so appealing to the cream of Russia's younger aristocracy that Catherine, despite having cultivated international admiration for her enlightened principles and policies, perceived the movement as a serious threat to the state and ruthlessly suppressed it. Though feared as a political threat, a fear that has periodically resurfaced, and not only in Russian history, the Rosicrucian movement was essentially utopian, otherworldly, and had no musket sights targeted directly at Catherine's empire. As Tatiana Artemyeva has demonstrated, the utopia offered by Novikov and his circle promises not only a perfect man but a perfect world as well, a world without slavery, poverty, taxes, despotism, or churches, a world of free believers purified from Adam's fall by free adoption of Masonic practices. The only step needed to create this perfect world is for everyone to become true, practicing Masons. Though totality, of this utopia, the unity of pedagogical, social, ontological, spiritual, technological, and cosmological orders, again points toward the comprehensive, multidisciplinary impulses embodied in the Fedorovian and Cosmist worldviews. In the early 20th century, when the Cosmist worldview was forming, the same impulses were at work in the 18th century, when Freemasonry prevailed. As Berdyaev put it, referring to his intellectual contemporaries, they all wanted to be Rosicrucians. Theosophy and Anthroposophy. As Maria Carlson has shown in her masterful study of the Theosophical movement in Russia, by the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, Russian interest in all things esoteric was only just beginning. The general European turn away from positivism and materialism, leading to the investigation and embrace of innumerable varieties of mysticism, supernaturalism, and esotericism, found special resonance throughout 19th and early 20th century Russia. Whether coming from such native sons as Alexander Pushkin, Nikolai Gogol, M.N. Nagorskin, and A.K. Tolstoy, or from foreign writers such as Swedenborg, Alpheus Levi, Louis Constant, and Pappu, esoteric literature found a very receptive audience in Russia. The culmination came in the writings and activities of Madame Blavatsky, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, who, though born in Russia, spent most of her life abroad and published first in English all the seminal theosophical works that would later be translated back into Russian. Although the Cosmists hardly overcite her writings, or mention them only in disparaging terms, echoes from her Isis Unveiled, first published in English 1877, and The Secret Doctrine in 1888, as we shall see, find their way into the Cosmist works more often than the Cosmists would care to admit. One of the early Russian theosophists, Elena Pisareva, translated, and with her husband published, Russian versions of the major theosophical works, not only by Madame Blavatsky, but also by her English and Indian followers, Annie Besant, Charles Ledbetter, Mabel Collins, and Kurupamalaj Jenar Dasa. Pardon my butchering of the names. Another major conduit for Blavatsky's theosophical teachings, not only for the 20th century Cosmists, but for late 19th and early 20th century Silver Age Russian intellectuals as a whole, was Rudolf Steiner's offshoot of theosophy, which he called Anthroposophy. Through his wife, Maria von Sievers, a Russian theosophist, Steiner, both in his early role as leader of German theosophists and later as head of his own movement of Anthroposophy, enjoyed close contacts with many influential Russian intellectuals, particularly the symbolist poet and thinker Andrei Bely and Bely's wife, the artist Asya Turgeneva. The major difference between Anthroposophy and Theosophy was one of emphasis. Where Blavatsky in the later Theosophists, particularly Annie Besant, emphasized the Indian and Tibetan roots of their esotericism, Steiner based on his Anthroposophy on Western Hermetic, Gnostic, Manichaean, and Rosicrucian sources. And where Theosophy was often characterized as esoteric Hinduism or esoteric Buddhism, Steiner himself often described Anthroposophy as esoteric Christianity. Russians were attracted to both Theosophy and Anthroposophy, but perhaps due in part to the scandalous reputation of Madame Blavatsky and the contrasting academic credentials of the strenuously upright Steiner. Russian intellectuals who acknowledged esoteric sources tended to cite Steiner rather than Blavatsky. In Russia, however, thanks mainly to the talent and energy of the president of the Russian section, Anna Kamenskaya, the Russian theosophical movement went on to thrive for 2 decades despite the controversies surrounding the earlier activities of Madame Blavatsky. According to Elena Pisareva, author of a vivid personal memoir of the early years of the Russian Theosophical Society, major activities of the Russian Theosophists included, in addition to publishing Russian versions of important theosophical and other esoteric literature, the running of vegetarian kitchens in major cities, the sewing of undergarments and other supplies for Russian soldiers during World War I, the sponsoring of public debates on leading social questions, the opening of kindergartens and daycare centers, and the presentation of cultural events including free public concerts of classical music arranged especially for workers and peasants. One of the early leading figures of the Masonic movement of the late 18th and early 19th century, Prince Ivan Alexeyevich Gagarin, 1771 to 1832, was the grandfather of the chief Russian cosmist Nikolai Fedderov. As an illegitimate child, both part of and not part of the Gagarin family, and only 3 years old when his grandfather died, Fedorov could not have had much direct contact with the Great Mason. But whether from the family library or from his later work as a librarian in the Rumyantsev Museum, which housed an extensive collection of Masonic and other esoteric literature, or from whatever other sources, as Zenkovsky, Bulgakov, and others have noted, Fedorov's ideas have much in common with, and perhaps owe much to, Russian esoteric Freemasonry of the 18th and early 19th century. To understand this better, it is now time for us to take a longer and closer look at Fedorov and his idea. Since recent research by scholars in Russia has brought to light biographical information previously unavailable or misreported, we shall present Fedorov's life in more detail, and we hope more accurately than has previously been possible in English. Thus concludes section 11.5 of the Russian Cosmists, the Esoteric Futurism of Nikolai Fedderov and his Followers by George Young. We will continue next time with section 11.6. I will see you then. Alam.